Abstraction is usually treated as a product of symbols, language, or mathematics. The evidence suggests it existed long before any of these. Long before abstraction could be written, it was already shaping behavior, space, and time. This is before logic, a history of rules before they were written. Abstraction did not begin as representation. It began as separation. Certain features of experience were treated as relevant, while others were disregarded. This process did not produce symbols or meanings. It produced equivalence. Different situations came to be treated as the same, with respect to limited structural relations. This form of abstraction did not require explicit comparison. It operated through tolerance of variation. Differences in material, location, or timing were accommodated as long as specific relationships remained intact. What persisted was not an image or a concept, but a stable, relational structure. Archaeological evidence suggests that this kind of abstraction operated through continuity rather than notation. Similar forms appear across sites despite differences in available materials. Spatial arrangements recur even as environments change. These patterns indicate that structural features were preserved independently of their specific instantiations. At this stage, abstraction did not isolate patterns as objects of thought. There is no evidence that early societies treated abstract structures as entities that could be examined, named, or manipulated. Instead, abstraction functioned as a selective constraint, stabilizing certain relations while allowing others to vary. This selectivity did not arise through deliberate analysis. It emerged through repeated engagement with comparable configurations. When distinct material situations supported the same structural relation, that relation persisted across instances. In lithic assemblages, this selectivity is visible in the preservation of fracture-dependent relations across varied geological contexts. Tools produced from different stone types exhibit comparable edge geometries and reduction sequences despite variation in surface appearance, composition, or origin. These surface properties were not decisive as long as fracture behavior remained consistent. Different materials could therefore be treated as structurally equivalent. In such cases, abstraction operated by isolating relational constraints rather than surface features. Form was established through controlled removal of material. What defined the object was not its appearance, but the structural boundary created by absence. Material equivalence was achieved without representation. Through this process, abstraction reduced complexity without formal simplification. The range of relevant features was narrowed, while incidental variation receded. Abstraction functioned as a stabilizing condition rather than an explicit method. The same principle appears in the persistence of spatial organization across environments. Archaeological remains indicate that certain spatial relations were maintained despite differences in location or material setting. Distances, orientations, and separations recur even as surrounding conditions shift. Here, abstraction operated on relations rather than on sites. The particular surface or enclosure varied, but relational configurations remained consistent. Spatial order was preserved without measurement, notation, or explicit planning. Abstraction also extended across time. Environmental cycles produced comparable conditions at regular intervals. Periods of light, temperature, or resource availability returned with sufficient consistency to be treated as equivalent situations. This equivalence allowed activity to continue across time without recalibration at each occurrence. Temporal abstraction emerged through recurrence rather than scheduling. Similar conditions were treated as interchangeable units, enabling continuity without representation. The body introduced further constraints that supported abstraction. Repeated movements required consistent results, despite variation in posture, fatigue, or resistance. Effective action depended on preserving relations such as direction, force, and alignment rather than exact muscular configuration. This regularity is observable in the consistency of projectile paths, impact locations, and tool edges across contexts. Variability in bodily state did not prevent equivalence as long as relational parameters were maintained. Material failure further constrained abstraction. When structural relations did not hold, divergence was immediate. Shattering, collapse, or inefficiency disrupted equivalence and limited acceptable variation. Abstraction became more specific through exclusion rather than expansion. At this point, a structural boundary becomes visible. Abstraction did not generalize freely. Relations effective within one range of conditions were not assumed to apply beyond it. Transfer occurred only where similarity was sufficient to preserve relational stability. This boundary imposed a ceiling. Abstract relations could be reused, but they could not be freely combined, extended, or compared across unrelated domains. Without external stabilization, abstraction remained necessarily local. One of the clearest material expressions of this limited abstraction appears in the practice of caching. Archaeological evidence documents the placement of tools or raw materials in specific landscape features for later retrieval. These objects were separated from immediate use, but retained a stable relation to a fixed location. In such cases, the object's functional status did not depend on continuous presence. The tool remained part of the activity system even while absent. The location itself functioned as a persistent coordinate, maintaining the relation between body and object across time and distance. This required separating a location from its surrounding environment. The specific ground surface, vegetation, or weather conditions could change, while the position remained structurally stable. The environment could therefore be navigated as a set of durable reference points rather than as a continuous sensory field. Spatial abstraction of this kind allowed relations to persist across absence. It extended portability without representation. Locations functioned as stable nodes without being mapped or symbolized. Abstraction also extended into the coordination of group activity. For collective systems to remain stable, actions had to be treated as equivalent across different individuals. Tasks such as tool production, maintenance of shared resources, or spatial monitoring could be performed by different bodies without altering the structure of the activity. In these cases, abstraction separated action from individual biography. The specific person performing the task was variable, while the functional relation remained constant. Group stability depended on this equivalence. This did not involve formal roles, titles, or explicit designation. Functional positions existed as relational constants rather than symbolic identities. Activity systems could therefore persist despite absence, replacement, or loss of specific individuals. Such functional abstraction preserved collective structure without representation. The group remained organized even as its composition changed. Stability was achieved through relational equivalence rather than through symbolic definition. These developments increased the reach of abstraction, but did not eliminate its limits. Relations could persist across absence and substitution, yet they remained embedded in practice. They could not be detached, inspected, or formally recombined. Here, a threshold is reached. Abstraction had produced stable equivalence, limited portability, and coordination across time, space, and individuals. However, it had not produced independent objects of thought. What remained absent was symbolization. There is no evidence of standardized marks used to denote abstract relations. Without symbols, abstraction could not be accumulated, compared across domains, or modified independently of enactment. This absence defines the limit of early abstraction. Relations endured through continuity of practice rather than durability of representation. Only with the stabilization of abstraction in material form could patterns become independent of performance. What can be stated with confidence is that abstraction preceded symbols. Equivalence emerged before representation. This sequence appears consistently across early material practices and sets the conditions under which symbolic systems later developed. In the next episode, we will examine models of reality before mathematics.